The Pentagon Papers were officially titled United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense. They reported the bombings of Cambodia and Laos, coastal raids on North Vietnam, and marine attacks that were not revealed through the mainstream media. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the anti-war protesters were right in having moral, legal, and pragmatic reservations about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, especially pertaining to the destruction of Southeast Asia and the quantity of U.S. soldiers' lives lost. An article in the New York Times says that the fact that the Pentagon Papers were not published earlier reveals that the Johnson administration systematically lied not only to the public but to Congress. Daniel Ellsberg released the papers to the New York Times in 1971. Ellsberg was a Cold War survivor, and he served in the Pentagon starting in 1964. He also served for 2 years in Vietnam as a civilian in the State Department. His experience in Vietnam led him to believe that the war was unwinnable, and he wanted to share his opinion with the public. First, Ellsberg approached members of the Senate, asking them to release the papers on the Senate floor, because no member can be prosecuted for anything they say on record before the Senate. Although a few senators were sympathetic, none agreed because they were all too afraid. At the time, Ellsberg was also working as a senior research assistant at MIT for International Studies, and there his connections allowed him to release the paper to a New York Times reporter. 3 articles were published in the New York Times, which joined forces with the Washington Post and other newspapers in an attempt to ensure the public was receiving as much information about the war as possible. After the 3rd article, the government temporarily suspended the publishing and took the case to court, saying that it was detrimental to our nation's safety. The release of the Pentagon Papers tremendously increased the amount of anti-war protesters, and although much of the Pentagon Papers were released through the newspapers, the Pentagon Papers were 7,000 pages and 47 volumes, and the entirety of the papers were not released until June of 2011. This shows that the effect war has on civil liberties can last long beyond the duration of the war. The vote in the courts was 6-3 that the publishing of the Pentagon Papers was not detrimental to our national security in any way, and that the actions of Ellsberg and the newspapers were justified by the First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of press, and therefore the publishing could continue. In response to this ruling, Nixon created a group called the Plumbers. They were a special investigations unit team in charge of preventing leakage of classified information. Nixon and his administration were upset and attempted to have Ellsberg indicted for stealing government property, amongst other things, but the charges were not considered valid because the prosecutors found that the Plumbers had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Although Daniel Ellsberg seems to be a figure of the past, a very similar situation happened with Bradley Manning in 2013. He was convicted for copying and disseminating classified military field reports. He will spend 35 years in prison. This quote was said after the conviction of Bradley Manning, but I think it has strong connections to the situation with Daniel Ellsberg as well. Ben Wisner, the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Speech Project, said, "When a soldier who has shared information with the press and public is punished far more harshly than others who tortured prisoners and killed civilians, something is seriously wrong with our justice system." Ben Wisner also said, "It's a sad day for all Americans who depend on brave whistleblowers and a free press for a fully informed public debate."
Bradley Manning said that he wanted the public to see at last, and this was the only way to do it, the reality of asymmetric warfare. I'd been in the Pentagon during the escalation of the war in Vietnam.
"We wish to emphasize we seek no wider war."
Oh, the public had been told, "We seek no wider war." That was a flat lie. Johnson did seek a wider war, and I, working under him, was working on the plans for that wider war, and I knew that perfectly well. I had the documents in my safe. I was part of a study of lessons from Vietnam known as the Pentagon Papers, which was top secret. Reading the Pentagon Papers showed that every president, going back to Harry Truman, had been warned that there was no success that lay ahead in Vietnam. And further death achieved nothing for anyone. It became clear to me that telling the president the truth wasn't enough to get us out of there. So I did decide to put out the Pentagon Papers, and the fact that they might help educate the public and end the war was worth my life. And I suspect strongly, without knowing him, that that's true of Bradley Manning.
I felt I had accomplished something that allowed me to have a clear conscience based upon what I had seen, read about, and knew were happening.